Hello everybody, welcome back to what is hopefully a bit of a shorter video today. The plan for today is to finish up talking about sociolinguistics. So we've spent the past couple of class sessions talking about different aspects of sociolinguistics, from what sociolinguistics is anyway, and our first one to talking about these three waves of historical linguistics and historical sociolinguistics. Have I been saying that the whole time? If I have, I've been meaning sociolinguistics. And looking at how sociolinguistics has changed over the past 60 years in both perspective and methodology. And then in addition, last class we used African American vernacular English as a case study to look at the real life consequences of these types of social perceptions and social perceptions and associations. The indexicality, if you remember that term, is what we talked about. I'm going to make myself slightly smaller. Hold on. So we looked at both some aspects of African American vernacular English, some myths about it, right? This idea that it's a collection of errors, that it's just broken English, that it's only used by people who don't learn proper English correctly. And we started to dismantle some of these associations by looking at the actual descriptional use of African American vernacular English, which shows that it's a systematic, rule governed, fully capable, fully functional, natural human language on par with any other. So today we're going to continue in that line, and we're going to finish up just a few topics that we didn't get to on Monday's class. Still looking mostly today at the real-life consequences of sociolinguistic associations and indexicality. So where we left off last time was looking at these sorts of things where, we looked at some really disturbing statistics about, sounding black people speaking African American vernacular English costing you 10% of your wages on average, or housing discrimination, or educational access discrimination between speakers of a more standard dialect and AAVE. And so today we're going to continue that up. Unfortunately, it's not going to get much lighter. We're going to get a little darker before we get a little bit lighter, but I promise we'll lighten things up at the end a little bit. So, an important event in the United States history, and particularly with a history of racial profiling and racism, is this event. This is a while ago now, over 20 years, but in February of 1999, 4 white police officers shot and killed this man, Amadou Diallo. He was an unarmed man, an immigrant from West Africa. Now, I wish that this were more newsworthy today, right? And we can talk about this perhaps some other time, that this sort of thing in 2020 wouldn't make news in most places. It would make news, but it would not be the breaking story that it was in 1999. We've been so inundated with this violence, in particular racial violence and police brutality, that these things, again, they brush off in the face of other stories that we hear on the news. And we want to stop and think about that, because this is not something that should be brushed off lightly, right? So these police officers shot Amadou Diallo. They shot him 41 times. They shot 41 bullets at Amadou Diallo when he reached for his wallet to produce identification. The police were later quoted saying that they thought he was reaching for a gun. And this sparked intense debate in the United States. This is Amadou Diallo. And it, in particular, started a line of research on priming effects in racial profiling and targeting of specific individuals that meet demographics, right? One of these studies was one done by Payne in 2001 called Prejudice and Perception, the Role of Automatic and Controlled Processes and Misperceiving a Weapon, right? And this is a direct response to this the shooting of Mamadou Diallo. And what they wanted to do is this study sought to prime people with prime participants with pictures of people and then test their reactions, right? This sort of underlying idea being, do we act differently when we see a white person versus a black person? Do we have differential paths of action when primed with these differences? And now priming, we'll talk about this quite possibly. We'll spend a good amount of time talking about this next week if we choose to get into psycholinguistics. But priming is this idea that exposure to a certain stimulus, so exposure in this case to people's faces, to the vision of people's faces, either increases or decreases the likelihood of some sort of action, some course of action. Right, the sort of classic here, it's a silly example, and it's not actually a very good example of priming, but it's something like, don't think of pink elephants. Right? Nobody think of pink elephants. And that it's actually this priming, it's the exposure to the stimulus of me saying pink elephants and talking to you about pink elephants that then primes you and makes a certain course of action more likely, that you'll in fact, of course, think of pink elephants. That's the joke here, but it's not always so trivial, as we'll see in this study. So with that sort of fast and dirty definition of priming, this is what they wanted to do. These are the actual pictures from the study, by the way. They would expose people to, you'd see one of these four faces in this experiment, so you'd be brought into a laboratory, you'd be shown a picture. This is the stimulus that you're exposed to, and then the course of action that they looked at was a weapon identification task. So after they were shown these images, they were shown an additional image and had to identify it as either a tool, like a workman tool, or a weapon, a gun. And what they found is that, so here's our pictures, right? So you're going to see an item, and you have to identify. You only see one of these, you won't see both of these, you'll see one of these, and you have to hit a button on the computer to tell me whether this is a weapon or a tool, the weapon identification task. And yes, these items look similar, right? That's the idea, is that it's not going to show you a picture of a gun versus a picture of, I don't know, what's a tool? An axe. Not an axe, maybe like a saw or something, right? These would be very visually different. But here, these look quite similar. You actually have to make some sort of decision process. You have to sort of think about it, actually look at it. And what they found is that participants who saw a black face, so a person who they identified as African American or black, were significantly faster in identifying objects as guns, and they were slower to identify tools. Let the meaning of this sink in, right, for a little bit, and examine in yourself what's happening here. So people who are primed by, say, a black male versus a white male, those who see a black male immediately are primed with these thoughts of associations of violence, presumably, and thus are more likely to identify weapons. Now, that intermediate there is conjecture on my part. We don't actually know what these people are thinking of, but we do have the evidence, hard evidence here in a well-run study, that there's a connection between the prime, the picture of a black individual, and a tendency or a priming of identification of weapons over tools. Once again, just like I said at the end of the last lecture, if you're wondering how you should be feeling about this, wondering what your emotional state should be while listening to me tell you these things, you're allowed to be mad, and in fact, I encourage that. This is deeply unsettling, right? This is deeply unsettling and gets at a lot of these sort of unconscious bias, this underlying deep-rooted, deep-seated racism that we have in the United States. this is getting at this. This is back in 2001 again, remember. So a follow-up study was done. Now that was your sort of divergence into psychology for a moment, but we'll veer back now into linguistics, where a very similar study was done, which was meant to be a direct follow-up to that original pain study in 2001. This is a study done at the University of Chicago, and it was called "Is That a Gun? Race, Dialect, and Violence Stereotypes." This was just a few years ago. I don't actually know exactly when that study was done. And what they did was they replaced the facial priming, so the priming stimulus, if you want to put it that way. They replaced the priming stimulus with instead a linguistic stimulus. Still a priming one, but they replaced the visual stimulus with a linguistic stimulus. And instead of seeing people's faces, you would hear somebody's voice. And what you would hear is somebody just simply reading a name, right? And half of the voices that you would hear were reading the names in an AAVE dialect, right? Using the particular phonetic and phonological characteristics of that dialect. Obviously, they're not using grammatical ones in this scenario since they're only reading names. And the other half were read in a more standard dialect. And these names were controlled, by the way, to be pretty unbiased, not be stereotypical black or white sounding names. So this was the prime. Instead of seeing the faces, you would hear somebody read a name in either AAVE or standard English. And I'm hoping now you can see some of the parallels that they're drawing, right? The idea, the hypothesis here would be that the African American reading of a name stimulus perhaps will mirror the visual stimulus of seeing a black person, and vice versa for the standard and the white, because there's this indexical connection between whiteness and standardness, right? In somewhat of the same way that there's a unfortunate connection, perceptual, not actual, between blackness and violence. Again, that's not a real connection. It's only real in the sense of people's perceptions of it. So after you would hear this stimulus, the participants were then asked to perform essentially the exact same weapon identification task where you had, the screwdriver or a gun or whatever. You had to identify them as either a weapon or a tool. And you probably won't be shocked to find that their original hypothesis was largely confirmed. Participants who heard someone speaking in AAVE were significantly faster in identifying objects as gun and slower to identify tools. The very same finding that the pain study had, except instead of using a visual prime here, they were looking at a linguistic prime. And this extends that priming research to show that it's not just a visual thing. It's all of these perceptions working together that influence and connect these associations, right? In this case, linguistic associations in the realm of sociolinguistics between the linguistic variant, in this case, some feature of the way these names were being read, and the associated social perception. In this case, whatever the social perception is, it's priming people to identify weapons more quickly than tools. Right, so once again here, we see one way in which, we looked at a bunch of ramifications of African American vernacular English and the negative stereotypes and perceptions that were associated with these. And we saw some concrete evidence of real life and non-linguistic negative consequences in the form of wage reduction and housing and educational opportunity reduction. And here we have another piece of evidence, another piece of the pie of what's going on here. And what is interesting about this is that this is getting at something that is more the underlying root cause. How is it that housing opportunities are reduced for African Americans in the United States? Well, here is a pathway of explanation, is that when the person who did that research was calling different housing associations or companies, he was either speaking, remember, in African American vernacular English or standard English, very similar setup to this study that you have here. So now we have somewhat of an explanation for why that was happening. People are actually tuning into these linguistic variables and making judgments and associations based on them, right? And that perhaps this is not even a conscious bias, right? Here is an important topic that I unfortunately don't have slides about, so take notes, if you will. Another thing that this study shows us is that this is largely unconscious. This actually doesn't show us, but we assume in some sense that this is unconscious bias, right? These people, these participants that are taking these tests are not necessarily racist, right? So the conclusion that we ought not to make based on the evidence that we've seen is that everybody who participated, or at least a substantial part of the people who participated in these studies, are racists and they're terrible people and they're the scum of the earth. That's just not true. It's not true. Chances are that this is not a conscious decision. The hypothetical situation that's happening is not somebody at a housing, at a, what can I think of words today? Words are hard. The situation isn't somebody at sort of an apartment complex, housing real estate agent that is getting these phone calls, hearing an African American voice and saying like, oh, I'm a racist, I hate black people, therefore I'm going to not give them housing opportunities. That's not what's going on, right? That's not what's going on. Instead, this is an unconscious thing, this unconscious bias that leads people to identify objects as guns more quickly and slower to identify tools. Instead, the take-home point would be that racism in these forms is persistent, is persistent even in a society when people aren't overtly racist jerks. Right, so on one hand, I'm telling you that don't hate these people, they're not necessarily all racist jerks. On the other hand, the fact that they're not racist jerks does not help the minority populations that are influenced by these consequences. Right, one more time for people in the back. The fact that all these people aren't super overtly racist, terrible people does not mitigate in any real sense the negative consequences of this institutionalized racism. So it can be, and I think it's very likely to be the case that people aren't flaming racists, and yet people are still suffering. There's still human suffering caused by this, the racist tendencies and associations held by people, right? Those can be simultaneously true, and it's not a negligible. It's not yeah. Well, as long as we're not overtly racist, then this effect can't be that large. No, you're wrong. It really can be a large and meaningful effect of these sort of subconscious biases. So it's a real and present thing, and this is essentially how institutional racism works in some senses, that people are not choosing to be racist jerks. They're choosing decisions that make sense for them. Again, thinking of housing is a really good example of this. Like, you just want, imagine in this hypothetical situation, you're an affluent middle-class white family, something. It's not terribly hard for me to imagine, but and you want to live in a place that's the best possible place for your family. And given your, maybe not exorbitant or luxuriant or over the top wealth, nonetheless, you have some means and you can afford a good place to live, so you choose the best place to live. And how real do we want to get today, right? Real, I think. I don't think we need to pull any punches. So you buy a nice place in East Grand Rapids, right? And thus, you move there with your affluency and you pay taxes on your income to Grand Rapids or to East Grand Rapids. And the school systems are good. And they're even better because they have now your funding and your backing of yet another affluent family. And so the children get good educations, they go to good colleges, they get good jobs, etc. And this cycle perpetuates itself in which these populations are advantaged over those minority communities who can't afford such good housing opportunities because of their own educational background or their own disadvantages, and that disadvantage perpetuates itself. And the fact, right, so we're talking in big, broad strokes here, but that system which perpetuates minority disadvantage and white privilege in this scenario is strengthened by the white middle class, white middle class's family decision to move to a nice neighborhood and have the best that they can for themselves. That decision that they made, in fact, strengthens the racist institution that pushes other people down. Ooh, does this get our hackles up? I can feel my own hackles rising here, right? Because that is an uncomfortable notion. Really, really uncomfortable notion. And again, we see that same dichotomy, that same split where is it an overtly racist decision for this white middle class family to want to live in this wealthy, nice neighborhood that has good schools? And that's a reasonable, logical decision for that family to make that has nothing to do with being racist. I want to reiterate that decision has nothing to do for those people for buying into a racist system. It's nothing to do with that. It's just a logical decision of where they should live given their means and their priorities. Can't be faulted for that. Yet, that decision nonetheless plays a role in the furthering of racist institutions, and again, this whole complex, this system of interlocking machinery which systematically disadvantages some human beings when compared to other human beings. Right? Do we see that connection? It's not that this family is racist, but it is that their decisions, logical and well thought out, perpetuate racist systems. Dang. Ooh, we did get real today, didn't we? We got real for sure. We'll talk on Friday. Think about this, right? Think about this aspect of prejudice and associations, and because this is a linguistics class at the end of the day, think about the role that language plays in either perpetuating or combating and correcting these types of institutions that we've been talking about for the past little bit. Think about that, right? And what we want to think about is, well, how do we combat this then? What do we do? What is our response to these things? Is the response for that white middle class family not to buy there? Not to buy a home, a nice home in a wealthy white neighborhood? I don't have all the answers, right? Like, these are things we need to be thinking about. Or are there other ways that we can combat them? Are there other ways that we can work towards a more perfect union there, right? And one in which people are all equally privileged and have equal opportunities. because that's not the world that we live in, right? And it is our duty to make that happen. We have an obligation, we have a responsibility to look out for other human beings, not just in East Grand Rapids, but outside of these bubbles, right, on a larger scale. And that the decisions we might need to make in order to bring about the change that we know needs to happen, we ourselves, affluent or not, black or white, right, rich, poor, whatever, might need to make some uncomfortable decisions and might need to take a long, hard, uncomfortable look in the mirror at the decisions we're making and how they're affecting the world in which we live. And again, not just the community in which we live. We need to open up our perspective here and embrace the humanity in humans, right? Because that's where humanity is supposed to apply. We need to embrace the humanity of humans and the realization that there are humans outside of my immediate vicinity that also count as my neighbor, right? Whoa, are we getting a little bit far afield here? But all of these aspects play into the ideas that we've been looking at these past couple of classes, especially with sociolinguistics, right? That language too is a vital piece of this. Okay, we're gonna move on. We're gonna move on from here, and we're gonna recall again the study of linguistic priming, in which the way that you speak affects in a very real and consequential way the ways that people are primed to act around you, the ways that people think about you in either conscious or unconscious ways. And one of the things that this study highlights on top of this kind of institutionalized racism problem is the advantages of code switching. The advantages of code switching. And code switching is the command of multiple ways of speaking. So this can be code switching between languages. I'm conversational in both English and German, and I can switch between these things. I can code switch between English and German. But this can also be extended or used to refer to command of multiple different dialects. Right? So if you're a speaker of both AAVE and something more standard, Midwest Standard American English, you can code switch between those varieties. And so beyond this is the harsh reality that, just as we saw in the last study, the way that you speak influences the way that people think and perceive you. Therefore, if you have command of multiple varieties, you have more control over the way that people think and perceive you, think about you and perceive you, right? And the associations they make about you. There are some videos here, which I encourage you to watch. We're not gonna watch YouTube videos on my YouTube video inception over here. That's not what we're gonna do, but I do encourage you to watch these on your own time. So this first one from Chandra Arthur is a story of an African American female who has an encounter with the police authorities and cites code switching as actually a very important factor of why she may even be alive right now. So that's a more serious one. If our conversation today has not been serious enough for you, the next two are much less serious. Although they play on serious topics, they just deal with them in a much more humorous way. This is Obama's anger translator from it's not the press conference, it's the speech where the president talks to all the press, like the dinner, the press association dinner or whatever it is. And there's a little sketch here from Obama and Luther, his anger translator. And the reason I'm posting these videos should become clear when you hear the way that these people are talking. And this last video is Key and Peele talking about code switching. These are comedians and media producers both African American that are very good at code switching between an African American vernacular English variety and a more standard variety, and they talk about the reality of that situation for minority populations across the United States and the role that plays then in the humor that they have. Watch these videos, and we'll be talking about some of them on Friday in our synchronous in-person class. So to sum some things up here and to reiterate the role of indexicality in all of this, right? We talked earlier about how, and we've been talking throughout, how these linguistic variables or variants can index things about the people who use them, whether those are positive things or negative things, right? At the very beginning of this series on sociolinguistics, we looked at this Canadian A. So Julian got in A, right, with that A at the end, which indexes somebody as Canadian. That is a linguistic variant that says something about the person who uses it. So now we can think, after looking at our AAVE case study, what AAVE indexes. Well, one thing that indexes that we've seen so far is that these variants often index group membership. So in the case of A here, Julian got in A, that use of a variable that's associated with Canadians indexes the speaker as a Canadian. That's group membership. And in the same way, use of AAVE features, linguistic features, indexes the person as a member of an African American community. Again, community membership. That's one thing that language indexes, is group membership. But very importantly, it doesn't stop there. Group membership isn't the only thing that is indexed by use of these variables. Right? Linguistic variables index much more than group membership, and we've already been seeing this in studies like the Payne and Use That Gun study. And what we'll see are these lines of associations, that we associate things in chains, so to speak. Right? So if, to use the Canadian example, if somebody says A, that will index them as Canadian. But then, once you think of that person as being Canadian, you also have associations of what you think is associated with being Canadian. What do you guys associate? Again, rein in, or make sure that we are being responsible and real with our associations here, but again, not hyper-prejudiced or racist. What are the associations with being Canadian? Well, in this case, they're not necessarily too negative. We associate Canadianness with friendliness, sort of, at least in my perception, chief amongst them. The Canadians are friendly and polite people. They say sorry a lot, right? Again, these are just perceptions. This is not necessarily rooted in reality, nor does it mean that Canadians are in fact nicer. Now, they may be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. Anyway, so you say A. Somebody says A, and that's known as a Canadian variable. So you associate that person with that group membership, being Canadian, but then you also associate them with being friendly because, you know, Canadians are friendly. So the use of this variable, A, indexes being friendly in addition to the group membership. This works a bit like the transitive property, right? To use another example, we can think of y'all. What's y'all? What are your associations with y'all? Well, it's often associated with Southerners in the southern United States. And again, this is also associated with friendliness. So now I can use y'all to either index myself as being from the United States South, or I can use y'all to index my friendliness. And we see this, right? It sounds, y'all sounds friendly, right? We have these perceptions, right? And this is called, so if basically, again, to reiterate the transitive property here, if y'all is associated with being Southern, and being Southern is associated with being friendly, therefore, y'all is also associated with being friendly. So this is the indexical chain, right? It's called indexical order. This is called the indexical order. Indexicality and the indexical order. That linguistic variants don't just index one certain thing like group membership, but they index a whole chain of things like being friendly. Because there are other associations with southernness, right? So southernness in the United States is also, for instance, associated with lack of education, moving at a slower pace, being friendly, southern hospitality. So using y'all, which is associated with southernness, can index you as all or any of those things as well through the process of indexicality and indexical order. This is a somewhat tricky or a complicated, complex phenomenon that's happening with language. This idea of indexicality and linguistic variables being associated with all these variable different properties. But it's an important one, right? It's at one aspect of how people use language. So if you want, we can even think about this area of sociolinguistics as being somewhat similar or on the same plane then as semantics and pragmatics. During semantics and pragmatics, we were looking at what's the meaning of language and what do people, especially in semantics, what does language mean? And in pragmatics, we were looking at things like, well, how do people actually use language and what are people doing with language? And here in sociolinguistics, we find another answer to that question. What are people even doing with language? Well, here's one thing. That it's not just about information transfer that I have to tell you that, well, I have a meeting at 3:30 and right, all these Gricean maxims of speaking properly and orderly and giving enough information. That's one thing people are doing with language. But another thing people are doing with language are creating for themselves identities out of language. They're picking and choosing in that third wave sociolinguistic vein. They're picking and choosing different linguistic variants to construct for themselves a persona. So if I want to be extra friendly, maybe I'll choose y'all. Maybe I'll choose y'all as my address. And for my next video, next Monday, I'll say, howdy y'all, how you doing today? Right? And I'll choose to use those southern linguistic variables to index myself as friendly and down home, right? Or maybe I'll even ramp this up and I'll also choose a different linguistic variable, this Canadian A, and I'll say, sunny Monday out there, eh? And I'll index myself once again as being friendly. Okay, I'm exaggerating here and I'm using like other phonetic markers as well, probably unsuccessfully. Don't hate on my impersonations or my accents too hard at the end of a lecture today. But that we're creating the idea of what we're doing with language is creating identities for ourselves by picking and choosing these linguistic variables. Okay, we're going to end on something a little lighter. I've got another video for you to watch. This is a video of Bella Hadid. You don't have to watch the whole thing, just watch part of it. It can be a little bit painful. And we're going to talk about this on Friday, and what I want you to do is listen to some of this interview. Listen to the way that Bella Hadid is using language and ask yourself that same question. What is she doing? What is the answer to which may not be immediately clear to you, and if you can't come up with an answer, you're probably not alone. But try to ask yourself, what is she doing with her linguistic choices here? What kind of indexes is she? In what ways is she trying to index herself as category A, B, and C? What are those categories that she's trying to index herself as through use of language in this really kind of awkward and bizarre interview? And we're going to talk about that on Friday in class. So have watched this video, at least have watched this video, or at least part of it. Like I said, you don't have to watch the whole thing, but at least watch part of this video and be ready to discuss this on Friday. Watch the code switching videos at your own leisure if you like. they're fun. They're interesting, especially some of the humorous ones you might find a little lighter to lighten up today's conversation. Anyway, that's all I have today. I thank you. I wanna say thank you to people for watching this in the class that I'm teaching or beyond, and for thinking about these things with I don't know what's the words that I'm looking for here. Thinking about these things critically and willing to be open and honest with ourselves about the state of the world and the role that both the language plays in it, from the aspect of linguistics in this class, but also the role that we ourselves play in this system that we're participating in, and how our own language plays into this system that we're participating in. And being open-minded, I guess. If anything that I said today, I should say, offends you, either my terrible accents or my use of racial examples, my use of specific geographic examples, that's not the intent. And while I'm still responsible for the things I say, I hope that I was not offensive in any way to anybody who's listening or watching this video. The idea here, the thrust of this lecture is to think critically about different social organizations, social bodies, social entities, and ways that we can improve them, right, for everybody, right? Ways to unravel this insidious, racist institutionalized racist society that we're living in currently, right? And I'm not calling anybody a racist. That's the other point, right? If anything I said today was like hit a little too close to home, I'm not jabbing that knife into you specifically. I'm jabbing it into, I don't know, some undercurrent of the society that we live in. I'm going to stop rambling. Hopefully you get my intent here. And I'll catch you guys on Friday. We'll talk about this stuff in more detail then. Until then, have a great day. Yeah, have a great day.